Ladies and gentlemen, it's Wednesday. We are DebateSensei, unstable connection and all. All right, we got Matt Shapiro, Esquire.
Hello.
We got Tim Stevie, Physolution, San Diego State University, assistant to the director of forensics. I am Jared Kubika Miller, your debate coach.
I am not worthy.
Oh man, so. When I put this up there, I misspelled trichotomy. I forgot they had an H in it. So
tracheotomy?
Yeah, tracheotomy.
I don't think that I've ever had to spell it all the way out. So yeah, I don't think I'd know how to spell it either.
Yeah. You think it's not a real word, but it's a real word.
Is it really?
Yeah. I looked it up. It just said 3-part division. I'm like, oh, well, hell, look at that. Huh. Awesome.
That's unique because debaters love making words that aren't words, like unique.
Yeah. Like dichotomy. False dichotomy.
Inherency.
False dichotomy.
Not a word. Inherency.
Yeah, you mentioned that. It's I don't believe you.
Solvency is not a word either.
No, solvency is, and so like a financial term, like whether or not something is
just solvent.
Yeah, you could be solvent, but whether or not your contract or your policy has solvency, I think is still a gerund of the term. So you can do that way.
Solvang is a nice place, I hear.
Yeah, I like that. All
right, guys. Okay, so trichotomy. Tricot. What does that mean?
What types of debate are there?
Yeah, not dictionary definition. What's tricot mean?
Maybe two?
Who wants to go?
Perhaps 3 types?
So in limited preparation debates, they see a lot of different resolutions. I mean, you'll get, like for a different resolution every round, just about. Whereas like other places like cross-examination, you have one topic all year long. So you don't really, get into a discussion about the types of resolutions. But that's what trichotomy is talking about, is the types of resolutions. And that's why some people call it resolutionality. So yeah. And
what we're talking about, the words of the resolution. And we're trying to categorize it. It's a touch of kind of similar to last week about framework, and we're kind of setting up how we're talking about at the beginning of a debate, in policy debate and cross-examination debate, for instance. It's almost ubiquitous that they are advocating some plan, some act, some action by some agent in the world, and anytime that happens, that's a policy, what we would classify in our trichotomy discussion here today as a policy style debate.
How do you often know that from the resolution?
Well, I mean, the easiest way is when the resolution is very straightforward and says something like, the U.S. federal government should enact the Green Deal, the new Green Deal, right? Like that's a directly telling you to enact a policy. Is that right? I mean, that's kind of
sound like an old man getting it all backwards. The Green New Deal.
The new Green Deal.
Yeah. Hey, these kids and their Green New Deal. Good.
Where's my sunglasses?
Too much money. That's the problem with it. That's it's never gonna float. Well, that's where I think people love that magic word "should," right? Like I hear that oftentimes as a standard in trichotomy debates because it is a procedural argument, right? I hear sometimes people saying like the resolutional, in their resolutional analysis, should being an action or policy focused word, it prompts a particular function to accomplish an end. So even if it's a metaphor around like this house should rock the boat, like that still uses an action word that implies the government team take some kind of action.
Yeah. And so it gets a little tricky, though, when sometimes they kind of imply policies. One of them that springs to mind is like universal basic income will be a necessity in an automated world, an actual topic, right? And so it doesn't say the word should in there.
Mm-mm.
And so the way that it's phrased doesn't necessarily fall into that policy sort of terminology.
We should
I would
probably
call that a fact round.
Yeah. It would tend to be on its face a fact debate. We should just spit this out very quickly for anyone who doesn't know. There's the policy style debates, there's the value, and there's fact debates. That's the three that at least I'm aware of.
And so the way I like describing it is like whether or not the resolution is a question of fact, a question of value, or a question of policy. Because especially with like the fact resolutions, people get confused. They're like, wait, if it's a fact, then why are we debating
a fact?
Yeah, why would you debate a fact?
Well, you say it's not a fact, right?
Yeah,
this reminds us Kim Jong Un. Remember when we were discussing whether or not he was dead, and we had an argument, and that was a fact argument where we were trying to prove, on one side or the other that he is in fact this based on all the information we can gather, and then the other side, their ground would essentially be that you use the other various news sources to prove how he's not, dead. And that we're literally talking about the words of the resolution. I don't want to sound too rudimentary here, but they will tend to lead you down a road themselves. And so again, in a resolution that Tim just brought up, anything that says should, the United States federal government should, especially if it says enact the Green New Deal, that is specifically calling for a very specific action. If in a round that comes to mind that I remember being a part of, defense wins championships. That was it was a limited prep round, but it was like it's a fact debate. And we classified that as a fact debate, and we were trying to prove that resolution just true in and of itself. We were on the app.
Or like general, you could do that. There's another way that I advise people to look at fact resolutions. If you're like, okay, this is a fact, you could say that this is true. Or, and this is the way I like it. I like this a lot. You could talk about whether or not it's good to call it true, right? And so that's kind of like the
loosen that ground up a little bit. Give yourself a little wiggle room.
And so it's kind of like our hot dogs sandwiches, or is cereal soup. You know what I mean? It's like okay, so what do we get out of it if we call it soup? It's like it's a choice that you could call something. To some degree, you could classify it that way. And so are we going to choose to call this a fact? I think is a legit way to frame a fact debate. Like instead of just whether or not it is true, it's like whether or not it is good to consider it to be true.
Oh, yeah, that's fair. So like I watched a really good round. I think it was an IPDA round that cheerleading is a sport. And so it was treated as a fact round, but they had really good justifications for as soon as something is labeled as a sport, it receives Title IX funding. It's required to have all kinds of insurance. It gets better coaches. And they had all this evidence of like, because cheerleading in most states is not classified as a sport, it receives really poor funding, and it has, low standards of like insurance and, all kinds of coverage. So they had really good reasons to say, if we do this, it will cause good things. So it was kind of neat. It was like a little bit of like policy stuff shook in there to say like, this is what happens if we do it. Was still an evaluation of whether or not this should be, noted as a fact, or whether we should, call this fact to be true. Yeah. Or make this claim true.
I remember also a resolution you brought up off the top of your head, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, Tim, when you said the United States federal government should emphasize the environment over the economy, or one of those vice versa. Mm-hmm. That's a good example. You brought up the word should earlier. And for as much as we do like, specific, hey, George, it's good to hear from you, buddy. As much as it's good to try to classify and categorize, like if you see the word should, it means policy, be careful, because I thought that example specifically kind of could be argued, for instance, as a value round and I think there would be ground to argue a tricot in that debate if, say, the app went up and said, this is a value round. We are framing this as a value round. And the neg gets up and argues with them on their, descriptor of this debate and saying this resolution is, in fact, a policy debate. Now you've actually tied part of this debate. Part of who will win is dictated on who does the best job beating that part of the debate. I mean, it could be a tiebreaker. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but especially back in the day.
It's supposed to be part of the framework, though. You know what I mean? It's supposed to be part of that introduction. What I think people miss a lot when they're debating resolutionality is like why it matters, right?
It's hard to articulate that.
Yeah, because the thing is that people just make that argument as just a way to make any argument. They don't explain why that changes any of the other arguments in the debate. Like you could still make all of the same arguments. Like calling this a fact round versus a value round versus a policy round. If it doesn't change anything else, if we're still making the same arguments and you're still preparing the same arguments, what's the big deal? You know what I mean? It's like, and so like creating these distinctions should have some sort of utility to them. And I think that's what gets missed in most of what people argue.
You know, I've seen in the example we're talking about, you know, the United States federal government should prioritize the environment over the economy. That is a pretty valid, almost equal ground to argue tricot on either side. Assuming I think we're talking policy and value. We talked a lot about abuse last week, framework abuse, fiat abuse. You can abuse tricot as well. Like if something says the United States federal government should pass the Green New Deal, and you come in and say this is a value round, I got to be careful with my words. I guess there's just times where it could feel more abusive. Like,
let me give you an example. So when people put this together, like the premise is that this debate resolution falls into one of these three categories and only one of these three categories. You chose the wrong one, you lose. But those same people are usually they're preparing two different types. It's like if they say fact, I'll say value, and if they say value, I'll say fact.
Exactly.
That inherently undermines the whole premise that there's only one that it belongs in. Like you can't, like if you're arguing that just to argue it, you're undermining the whole premise of the thing in the first place. So that's
I guess if you have like no meat, like advantage or disadvantages, and you have no idea what to do, I guess, just attacking trichotomy is one way to just like filibuster your way into hopefully tricking someone, including the judge, into, thinking you're right without merit on case.
There's a legitimate time and place for trichotomy because it is a procedural argument, just like topicality, just like various solvency presses or an inherency press. Like there's a good ground for it. The only time that I've ever actually run tricot in a round, it won, but it was for a pretty weird resolution. So the resolution was this was in quite a while back, and the NCAA had just done some really awful thing for its athletes. Like there was a big union that wanted them to be treated as employees and they should get paid, and they shot it down. And the resolution was the NCAA should not have done this thing. And the other side instead, the other side ran it as a policy round. So we were on the negative. They ran it as a policy round where like the NCAA passes this. And they said like, well, the resolution contains the word should, therefore it's, policy. And we said, no, this is a fact round. We need to evaluate whether they should or should not have done it. So we need to, pose all the evidence of, or honestly, maybe we said it was value. This was like 7 years ago. But we, said that you need to be, weighing what would have happened if they had, what would have happened if they hadn't. That isn't proposing a new plan. That's evaluating. So I think we did say it was fact. Like that's evaluating the facts of the round. And here's all of our prep. And we say that this round should be weighed on the preponderance of evidence, not on like net benefits or whether or not your policy is good. Because like, sure, your policies may be great, but that doesn't actually address the resolution of whether or not this action was good or bad. So here's all of our evidence and why it was, prep time skew and all those kinds of, standards that you use with a procedural argument. And we ended up actually winning on it, even though the other side was kind of hard in on like, no, it has the word should. And I think there's an example of where it is not always the case that should implies policy. You can go in a different direction on it, or it can mean something different.
That's one of the examples that I think is really great for like, okay, so was there anything else about their case that didn't sort of meet this fact versus policy resolution? The arguments that they brought up, if they just kind of framed it in a different way, if they just said, okay, if they would have passed it, then they would have got these advantages, is not really all that different from if we pass it, there's these advantages. You know what I mean? So like, I'm wondering, like, is there any difference between the strategy beyond that that one distinction about how you sort of frame it, you know.
Well, it was that they passed a new policy. They invented something entirely new. So it wasn't they were passing the plan which was shot down. They passed something entirely new.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And so and so if they base any advantages off of brand spanking new planks of the plan, then so here's one of my suggestions is that you don't always have to go for the absolute win-loss in this thing. You could also impact it out to severance, meaning that any advantages that they link based off of this sort of faulty interpretation, you sever. But anything that does link based off of, on our mutual sort of understanding, that still applies. We will still argue that out. You know what I mean? And so I love that. It makes you sound so reasonable. It's kind of like, it doesn't mean that everything you said is irrelevant. It just means this one thing is out of bounds.
Interesting. I've never heard that before. So you said it's like would that be like the voter level of like, don't vote them down because just remove any, or so it would be like severability.
Right. At the voter level, people don't take advantage of the options you have because they always just go for it's a straight up win.
A priori.
Yeah.
And education. And we've lost all education because we have to talk about this instead of the round. And therefore we're all dumber for having done this. Like,
I mean, I think let's talk about kind of like the extension levels of, how to articulate why, if there's a pretty clear resolution, which everything is arguable, but if it tends to show it goes one way, I think just to run with the Green New Deal, if someone gets up there and goes, well, we're going to pass the Green New Deal, and I've redefined what Green New Deal is, and so this is my plan, and I just usurped the name Green New Deal. What you could attack that, you could attack the faulty interpretation, as Jared just said, and say like, there's education in the round. We all prepared to, debate the merits of the Green New Deal, and now we are losing our ability to learn and stuff like that. So there's extensions from these arguments, which I think goes to the significance, as Jared was talking about, explaining why they matter. The words do in some way, shape, or form matter, and we all have to be able to prepare for the debate, and we all came here knowing what to debate, and they're being abusive and just commandeering it and bringing something new.
The most brilliant thing I've ever learned about like procedural arguments, resolutionality, topicality, stuff like that, is to really press them on like, so what did you want to argue that you can't now? Like, what was it? Like, not just in hypothetically, what did you actually do during prep time that I am now abusing?
Well, I tried to find the trickiest definitions ever, and then I found them and I put them in my flow sheet. Do you want to see them? Like,
like, because what I'm thinking is like people spend way too much time on this sort of interpretation, and I really want more people getting to the debate of the topic, not just the debate of debate. Like whatever topic you're given, like if you can identify what the central sort of contention is and win your side of it, it's just impressive because it's a lot more rare than you think. You don't get to the center of and
it lends so much to your credibility, either in that round or just with the judge and the other team forever. I mean, if you just put a bunch of tricot, what's the other one? Oh my goodness, what's T? Topicality. You just put these in your back pocket and go into a round going, no matter what happens, I'm just going to blow all these things out, and I'm going to spend 5 minutes of my 8 talking about stuff that just I want to gunk up the debate. When it's not merited, or at least you don't make it clear as to why it's merited, and you're just doing, as we always talk about, you just kind of rattle off the buzzwords that your coach taught you, you lose credibility. Like, you now are working, in my opinion, as a judge from a disadvantage, because it seems like you're just grabbing little tricks that you learned in debate and implementing them without, like Jared said, like attacking. You had time to prepare for a very specific, often very specific debate, and you kind of knew what to anticipate, and your time should have been spent learning and arguing for your side on the merits, more so than just pulling out your stop, in procedural arguments, in framework, for instance.
Well, I think Jared's point would definitely ring true, like in the days of points of information, or now in the days of flex, to ask the question, make it, straight up. If you're on the affirmative and the other side is running tricot or anything else,
Yeah.
what was it that you wanted to debate about that we cannot debate? Like, show me the prepped flow sheets that you now have to throw in the garbage completely blank, right? Because like 90% of the time, they probably don't have one. Now, if they have them, they'll probably bring it up in their actual speech. Like, we had all of these prep disadvantages that we can no longer use because of whatever. Like, make it, draw attention to that as a piece of it. And then my favorite thing that I saw some teams do is throw a counter voter on various procedural arguments, like calling it a time suck. Like, if the other team
it could be
just to force the affirmative side, the MG speech, to eat up time answering procedurals, and they now kick these procedurals, that is intentionally a time suck on the MG speech. Vote them down for playing the game of debate instead of actually debating the debate. And so I thought that was kind of a neat thing that changed them down to that procedural. They have to stick with it, because if they kick it, that kind of triggers a counter voter. So I thought that was a neat piece of defense against it. But I mean, I think that trichotomy can be super important, though. Like, I think that there is a really large trend towards every resolution, every round shoehorning itself into policy.
Yeah.
And many rounds are really not meant for policy. Like, they are really meant to be value rounds, right? So they're like, we should prioritize one thing over another. I suppose you could do that as a policy if there's one particular policy that like takes from one bucket and feeds it into the other. If you were, say, like prioritizing the environment,
especially if it's really big in the news, like at that time or something like that. But it's not quite.
Like there exist topics like that when they are comparative topics that are value based. Like, United States federal government ought to prioritize, the security of the people over the, privacy or whatever. Those kinds of comparative things kind of beg the question of a value. Like, what is most important and why do we value that, right? Or like, this is harmful to democracy, right? I see a lot of those rounds, a lot of like the Electoral College is harmful to democracy. That's not asking for a plan. Like, sure, maybe there are some great plans that address that, but that is a question of value of like, if we value democracy, how do we best attain that? Like, is the Electoral College good or bad for this particular value? So if one were to run a fact round in that, or if they were to run a policy, that would genuinely be kind of abusive. Like, that's a misinterpretation of the resolution. And that means the other team that prepped for a pretty straightforward value round can't use those arguments. So I think that there is still solid justification for tricot in many cases.
Yeah, but I mean, that justification still rests on testing what are value arguments versus, because if I came up with a particular sort of case area that really encapsulated that sort of, that if this versus that sort of debate, and it's just like a nice sort of crystal clear case study, I'm like, listen, if this policy is advantageous, it proves it true. If not, then it proves it false. It's a case study.
Right, yeah. That'd be a good one. So it's like, okay, we're going to drill in the Arctic because that is a direct prioritization of the economy over the environment. Like, those are the two things that are in contrast.
Because it's great for my profit margin.
Is a perfect test of it. So yeah, right?
Yeah. So you say, listen, if this is true, then this policy should be positive. You know what I mean? And should be advantageous. If it's not true,
way to weigh that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the framework that way that's why people do the sort of like policy on everything, because case study is a completely legitimate way that academics study stuff. Like big difficult questions are handled through case studies. And so if you have one, as long as you frame it that way, now you start with a resolution that sounds kind of like a value, but you're like, all right, the method we're using is policy.
I think one of the reasons, we're kind of honing in on this question of like, why do people pigeonhole every debate into a policy debate? I think, in my experience as a debater, the biggest thing I think comes from we are very familiar with how to run policy debates, meaning the structure of what your flow looks like, the tags for your arguments. It's very consistent, and there is a element when you start going into a fact or a value round very quickly when you go, okay, so there's no plan text, and theoretically there's no advantages, and so there's no disadvantages. So what do I do? What am I supposed to do? And one trick or one thing I've done, in fact, in value rounds is you label your arguments. You still do a framework, by the way. At least in Parley, I would still run a framework where you define the terms. You do a tricot argument, and you say this is a value. You still run a criteria, and you say, if we can prove through this lens that we're the better team, we win. And then you get to contentions. That's the word I used. I'm sure a lot of people still use that word. You can label your arguments differently, but the key to understanding is if you're not in a policy round, and what's so scary about not being in a policy round is you don't run a plan, you don't have plan specs, and you don't have advantages or disadvantages or counterplans. You have other arguments, like Jared said, case studies is the biggest one I can imagine. When I ran Defense Wins Championships, our first contention was the Lakers that year. This was a long time ago. And I was just pulling, basically random, facts or whatever, proof as and you label them the same, like subpoint A, it's not quite as simple as what we're used to in policy because we're so familiar with the arguments. But go ahead.
Part of it is that people understand the stock issues of policy so much.
That's better. What I'm saying. Yeah.
There's other stock issues. And the other problem is that you lump this stuff as just facts into a single category when there's at least two subcategories in that one thing. There'd be categorical and causal facts. Those are two different ways of stating something factually, right? And they don't have the same stock issues. So
analogous, causal, and what was the other one?
Categorical. So categorical is like cereal is soup. Putting something into a category, cheerleading is a sport. Those are categorical claims. Those are factual claims. Whereas causal claims are like, UBI is going to be needed in an automated future. So that's like this is going to cause a few things. You're just kind of inferring, predicting where something goes, right? So or like who's going to win the World Series this year could be the source of a debate. So those are two, but there's also, the value
coronavirus.
Value also has the same problem because it has a couple of subcategories as well, where there's comparative value, that's the this versus that, but you also have intrinsic value resolutions where like something is valuable in and of itself, like
Jared.
Like privacy is important, and so. And you're arguing that's important, that we should protect those things. So you're not comparing it to anything. So those also have different stock issues. So the problem is that we're trying to find like one way to do fact rounds when we actually need to have two, and the same thing for value.
Can you run both in a single fact round, like a comparative and a causal?
I don't know how you raise a sentence that's both categorical and causal, at least not off the top of my head. You know what I mean? But the thing is like I think Descartes.
I mean, like contention one, causal, or contention two. The other
like the resolution sort of fits just one or the other.
Yeah, the resolution, the wording of the resolution really kind of like settles into one versus the other. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be both.
Once you lock into one, you just have different contention one with 4 or 5 subpoints proving like one specific case study, and then moving on to contention two and doing it again with a different case.
Issues. I think it was Descartes that was talking about like categorical stock issues at one time, where they were like, they have to be mutually exclusive. They have to be exhaustive. So anything you put into the categorical system, it goes into one and only one place. There should be a place for everything. You know what I mean? And like, there's like these rules for how to do categorical stuff that are supposed to be like the proper way of doing it. And so you could use that as your stock issues. Is like, here's why it's mutually exclusive. Here's why it's exhaustive. Here's why, it's like, there's other stock issues out there. People just don't look it up.
Descartes was a huge fan of Marie Kondo, like organizing.
I might be wrong, but I think it was Descartes.
I might be wrong.
Yeah, I was looking this stuff up. I'm like, there's got to be some stock issues.
I never really thought of. I mean, we all create these stock issues, and then we agree on them over time, and like that stuff tends to evolve. So I think that would be really awesome. I would love to see a team bring in some unique stock issues, pieces like that, fundamental requirements that a debater would have to have.
Yeah. Tricot, it's not quite as popular. I mean, even when I was debating a long time ago, it wasn't super common. I mean, but when you see it, oftentimes, you won't even prepare a tricot and someone does something insane in the round and it comes out.
It's kind of a novice level sort of argument. I see that a lot. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a lot rarer. Like, not that I haven't seen it in out rounds in open, but it's just really rare to see that as the direction.
When you see it, call them out. That's what I'll say on tricot. You know what I mean?
So, I mean, we did it a few times, but I don't.
Really? We don't have a plan, so let's just run 4 tricots and a topicality and get out of
here. 4 tricots.
Well, I'm like 2 minutes. Here's a freaking tricot argument. I don't know. So.
Oh man.
All right. Well, everybody, that's our time. I hope you enjoyed it. Catch us next week. We'll be talking about something similar. We got Tim CV. We got Matthew Shapiro. I'm Jared Kabika Miller. We'll see you next week.